Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I think we can start. We have a very, very interesting panel with well-known and very distinguished speakers. We live in a very, very exciting period. I mean, if a year ago someone would tell us that the world would be as it is, we would be very, very much surprised. Things change very, very rapidly, and some basic pillars for economic stability, international law, etc., are disputed today. So we have many, many challenges for our societies. I think that our societies face some very, very important challenges. First of all, how to harness economic technological development. In my view, a very, very important role for our democracies is the restoration of a rigorous middle class and solidarity for the less developed countries. And of course, environmental sustainability. We have speakers who will deal with all these issues. And we'll start with Professor Lucas Papademos. He's well known to all of us, but allow me to mention some very, very basic features of his career. Mr. Papademos was born in Athens. Studied in the United States at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Surprise to some of you is that his bachelor degree was in physics, a master's degree in electrical engineering, and a PhD in economics. It might be worth mentioning that his mentor and his thesis advisor was Franco Montigliani, who later received the Nobel Prize in Economics. And Mr. Papademos served as a professor at Columbia University, professor of economics, and he assumed a similar role at the University of Athens, 1988 to 1993. In 1980, he worked as an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and from 1985, later on as advisor at the Central Bank of Greece. He became governor of the Bank of Greece in 1994, a position he held until 2002. In 2002, he was elected as vice president of the European Central Bank, a position he held until 2010. And in 2011, Professor Papademos, Governor Papademos, was asked to help the country in its effort to rescue its economy and avoid, exit from the European Union and the Euro area. And he was quite successful in that. We thank him for that. Today, he is going to talk to us about the main challenges Europe and Greece faces. So his speech has a title, Innovation, Competitiveness, Growth and the Future of the European Economy. Mr. Papademos, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for your kind and complimentary introduction. Dear President, dear colleagues, dear distinguished participants, this inaugural symposium of the International Community of Academies is a very special event indeed. And let me start by saying that I'm pleased and privileged to address such a distinguished audience. The themes of the symposium are appropriately wide-ranging including topics concerning the effects of AI on sciences and societies, the lessons of history, culture, ancient thought, as well as the challenges being faced from climate change and mega disasters, natural or human-triggered. I will focus my remarks on the economic policy challenges currently confronted in Europe, which are largely human-triggered, and on the future of the European economy, a future which inevitably is intertwined with developments in the global economy at a time when the outlook for economic globalization, its nature and extent, is highly uncertain. In predicting and assessing the future and advancing proposals on how to improve it, we must first define our objectives, our vision for the European economy in the years to come, and then evaluate their attainment in light of the European economy's past performance, in view of the policies currently being implemented or planned, and taking into account the expected effects of other determining factors, notably the consequential technological change, including the AI revolution and the evolving geopolitical landscape. So the fact that the future of the European economy will be determined by both internal and external factors underscores the importance of international competitiveness in determining the European economy's capacity to grow and prosper. In my view, and I expect we can all agree with this, the fundamental objectives of the European economy are growth, prosperity, stability, and security, which could be summarized using the acronym GPSS. These objectives have to be elaborated in terms of the exact contents and of their interdependence. And they may also be supplemented and related to other important goals for Europe, notably environmental sustainability, the preservation of democracy and freedom, and the completion of the European project. In my presentation, I will concentrate on 4 issues pertaining to the future of the European economy. First, the prospects of higher, sustainable, and equitable growth in light of the economy's past performance. Second, the crucial role of innovation and competitiveness in raising productivity and supporting robust and sustainable growth. Third, the policies and reforms required to boost innovation and improve competitiveness. And finally, the general financial and fiscal requirements, the institutional reforms, and the political conditions that are necessary for fostering innovation, promoting competitiveness, and achieving higher and sustainable growth. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I think you all know, the past performance of the European economy since the beginning of the century reveals troublesome trends in output and productivity growth in Europe relative to the US and China, trends that raise serious doubts about its future growth potential. Europe's economic growth has been persistently lower than in the US over the past 2 decades, and substantially slower than that of China, especially over the past 10 years. As highlighted in the report of Mario Draghi published in September 2024, the difference between the levels of GDP in the US and the EU steadily increased from about 15% in 2002 to 30% in 2023. And a consequence of these developments was the significant relative deterioration in the living standards of European households. Real disposable income per capita has grown almost twice as much in the US as in the EU since the year 2000. So looking ahead, forecasts for GDP growth in the euro area and the EU by European and international institutions and from surveys of private sector forecasters predict very moderate growth for Europe, ranging between 1.1% to 1.4% over the medium term. That is for the 3-year period 2026-2028, compared with projected average growth over the medium term of 2 to 2.5% for the US and 4 to 4% for China. Growth forecasts over the longer term are not provided explicitly by international institutions and European institutions, presumably because of the high uncertainty surrounding the implementation of future economic policies, as well as the evolution of the geopolitical environment. What we already know, however, is that a number of factors that have supported growth in Europe in the past, notably rising international trade, inexpensive energy availability, and geopolitical stability, cannot be expected to support economic growth in the foreseeable future. And available long-term projections, not by official institutions, but by the private sector and other governmental agencies, all suggest that over the coming decades, growth in Europe is going to remain very modest and significantly lower than in the US and China. So, 2 conclusions emerge from this review. First, there is a clear and present danger of suboptimal economic growth in Europe in the future, with adverse effects on living standards and the attainment of other fundamental goals. And second, as a consequence of the previous conclusion, is that there is an urgent need for decisive, effective, and coordinated actions to significantly improve growth prospects in the European economy, which is an important goal in its own right, but it's also essential for enhancing prosperity, strengthening security, preserving democracy, freedom, and environmental sustainability. Now, theoretical analysis and empirical evidence have shown that economic growth is essentially determined by productivity growth. That is, the progress made in converting inputs, such as hours worked, into goods and services, which allows companies to increase wages and profits, thus improving living standards. Productivity growth, in turn, depends on the contribution of several factors, notably and importantly in recent years, technological advances and innovations. This conclusion is demonstrated by the evolution of labor productivity in Europe relative to the US since the end of the Second World War. EU labor productivity had converged from only 22% of the US level in 1945, after the war, to 95% in 1995. But subsequently, labor productivity growth has slowed by more than the US and fallen back below 80% of the US level in recent years. Now, several factors have contributed to the slowdown in productivity in Europe, especially relative to the US. But the ineffective innovation ecosystem and the erosion of international competitiveness were the main contributing factors. Indeed, and that's the last point that I will make regarding the past, the main reason EU productivity diverged in Europe from the US in the mid-90s was Europe's failure to gain from the digital revolution led by the internet, both in terms of generating new companies and diffusing digital tech into the economy. And in fact, it has been shown that, and I'm quoting a sentence from the Draghi report, that if the tech sector is excluded, EU productivity growth over the past 20 years would be broadly at par with the US. So looking forward, the available evidence and market assessments indicate that Europe will continue to underperform in the development and use of advanced technologies that will generate higher growth in Europe. For example, with regard to quantum computing, which is expected to be the major technological innovation in the future, the involvement of European companies is currently very limited. Now, moreover, over the past 15 to 20 years, as I mentioned earlier, the European economy's overall competitiveness deteriorated substantially. And the notion of competitiveness I'm referring to is not the narrow one, which is defined by measures of relative labor cost and relative prices aimed at increasing market shares. The broader notion of competitiveness, which is relevant now, is largely determined by the knowledge, skills, and technologies embodied in the labor force. Hence, the main determinant looking forward of the European economy's competitiveness, it's its innovation capacity. That is, the effectiveness of the innovation ecosystem, which is comprised of four components. And since I think many of you are not really related to these issues of economics, let me mention that the innovation ecosystem of the economy comprises four elements, four components. The first is the creation of scientific and technological innovation. The second is the transmission channels of scientific and technological innovation to commercialization, that is, to the development of innovative products and services. Third component, a financial system that supports innovative companies to grow and flourish. And finally, education and training systems that can equip the labor force with the necessary skills for making productive use of technological advances. Over the past 20 years, Europe has not succeeded in building an effective innovation ecosystem. Although a number of measures have recently been taken and others are being planned by European and national authorities to address the identified problems, market participants are not convinced that they will make a significant difference, that these measures will close the innovation and productivity gap between Europe, the US, and China. In a recent survey of more than 200 economists, which was carried out by the Financial Times last December, confirms this conclusion. The majority of the respondents to the survey expected the US to extend or maintain its productivity lead with the rest of the world in the coming years. And the reasons mentioned by most respondents included US lead in AI and other emerging technologies, deep and dynamic capital markets, lower energy costs, and a flexible labor force. So what are the policies and reforms to boost innovation and improve competitiveness in Europe? Official reports, academic analysis, and market assessments concluded that decisive, as I mentioned earlier, and appropriate actions are urgently needed to close the innovation gap between Europe and the US and improve the competitiveness, growth, and prospects of the European economy. In order to boost innovation and improve competitiveness, we must first identify the fundamental weaknesses in the structure and the functioning of the European innovation system. And we must also identify the obstacles to improving the effectiveness and efficiency so as to promote the development of advanced technologies and, importantly, the diffusion of these technologies in the economy. Now, diagnosis of the problems and recommendations for appropriate therapies have been elaborated, notably in the important report of Mario Draghi and also the earlier report of Enrico Letta, as well as in recent papers by many academics, including Philippe Aghion, a recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics this year. There is not enough time. These reports and the academic analysis that have been produced have identified both structural and institutional weaknesses, as well as obstacles that are affecting adversely the functioning of the European innovation ecosystem. Now, there is no time for me to elaborate on the many actions needed to boost innovation in Europe, but I would like to point to 3 policies and reforms that I consider essential for boosting innovation, and both by directly addressing weaknesses in the structure and the institutions of the system through supportive actions, and by removing specific obstacles to the effective and efficient functioning. First, the financial resources to support research and innovation by the public and private sector should be significantly increased. Of course, accompanied by policies and reforms to ensure the appropriate focus of research activities and the efficient use of advanced resources. Comparing the research and development, or the research and innovation as it is now called, funding in the US and the EU, justifies the proposal specifically that the budget of the new EU framework program for R&I should be doubled to 200 billion euro per 7 years. And in particular, something that may be of interest to many of you, the financial resources available to the European Research Council for supporting promising fundamental research focused on advanced technologies, which can be either proposed by individual researchers and interesting also by institutions, research institutions, should also be doubled in line with the recommendation of the Draghi report. Second, the channels of transmission of scientific and technological innovation to commercialization should be substantially improved by, first of all, eliminating excessive regulatory requirements on small companies, by abolishing unnecessary bureaucratic procedures, by harmonizing rules and legislation concerning the management and protection of intellectual property rights across the EU, and by establishing conditions to facilitate sufficient financing of startups and the scaling up of companies. And third, the available financing for startups and for companies that aim to scale up into larger firms should be increased significantly and become more flexible by expanding sources, channels, and the instruments of their funding. And this can be achieved by increasing the amount and the modalities of financing by the European Investment Banking Group, by fostering an environment for debt and equity funding, and by establishing conditions, sometimes they're called clusters of innovation, that will facilitate financing by venture capitalists, and more generally by making progress towards the integration and deepening of European capital markets. Now, dear colleagues and distinguished guests, the final and critical issues that should be addressed in assessing the prospects of European economy is whether, when, and how all the necessary reforms and policies for boosting innovation and improving competitiveness will be implemented promptly and effectively. This brings me to the last part of my remarks on the major economic, policy, and political challenges ahead, which concern the overall financial and fiscal requirements, the institutional reforms necessary, and the political decisions for a meaningful quantum leap towards improving the competitiveness and the growth prospects of the European economies. Now, the financial requirements to achieve the objective of improving competitiveness, which include the funding needs for boosting innovation, reducing energy prices, and becoming carbon neutral and increasing security, is really huge. According to the European Commission estimates, which have been confirmed by the European Central Bank, an additional investment of 750 billion to 800 billion euro will be needed each year, which corresponds to about 4.5% of the EU GDP. The financing of this investment will have to be provided both by the private and the public sector, which in previous years have correspondingly financed 80% and 20% of productive investment. But for this to happen, it will be necessary to take decisive steps towards the integration of capital markets in Europe, towards the completion of the so-called Capital Markets Union, and to agree on additional direct government investment by the European Union, but also by national governments. Now, the establishment of a Capital Markets Union has been an existing objective, an important part of the goal of the single market, which in principle is accepted by all, but in practice it has not been attained, partly because of differences across member states in clearing and settlement systems, insolvency regimes, and long-term capital requirements. But the main underlying reason is the reluctance of countries to transfer national sovereignty to a single market authority. I'm hopeful, however, on this, that significant progress will be made towards the integration of European capital markets as a result of a new initiative by the European Commission, which is based on the principle of forming, in quote, a coalition of the willing. Now, the funding of the required investment by the public sector, both the Commission and the national governments, is the great policy challenge ahead for several reasons, but mainly, again, because it requires the transfer of sovereignty for fiscal decisions to European institutions. And two relevant points need to be made. The first concerns the proposed new EU budget for the 8-year period 2022-2034, which amounts to almost 2 trillion euro. Now, the new multi-annual EU budget has many attractive features. It's characterized by more simplicity, flexibility, and focus on the Union's main strategic objectives. Importantly, it proposes to allocate 451 billion euro for funding competitiveness, research and innovation, and to do so in a more structured and simplified way. The new European Competitiveness Fund is broadly in line with the recommendations of the reports of Draghi and Letta. It is also important that the EU research framework, which is connected with the Competitiveness Fund, will allocate to the new Horizon Europe 175 billion euro to finance innovation. Well, these are the good news. But there are also serious issues that must be addressed regarding the size of the new EU budget, the process ahead for approval, and its eventual implementation. The total size of the new EU budget, as I mentioned, seems impressive, almost 2 trillion euro, but it is for 8 years, and it corresponds to only 1.26%, much less than 2% of the EU GDP. This amount is well below the recommended amount in the Draghi report for supporting innovation and competitiveness, and below the real needs for achieving the broader common EU objectives, unless it is supplemented by direct investment by national governments. However, the investment by national governments is constrained and may be limited because it has to be decided so as to be consistent with existing rules on fiscal deficits and public debt at a time when in many countries the debt-to-GDP ratio is high and may be rising. So for all these reasons, I consider that among other fundamental institutional reforms that must be addressed, including the veto power of member states, it is imperative that a more integrated economic and fiscal policy framework in the Eurozone and the EU will be adopted for the attainment of shared objectives, notably to strengthen defense and security, and to establish the appropriate conditions in order to make Europe a world leader in a new knowledge economy, which is driven by technology and innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, let me make two final brief points of a more general nature regarding the prospects of the European economy and of the European Union. Undoubtedly, the outlook is surrounded by extraordinary uncertainty and is subject to multiple risks, mainly but not exclusively associated with global and national political developments. Nevertheless, the outlook for attaining higher and sustainable growth in Europe is potentially favorable because it is based on sound foundations, notably talented researchers, outstanding universities and research institutions, as well as industries that have delivered competitive products in various fields. What is needed in order to translate the potentially to truly, is to implement the appropriate reforms and policies outlined above so as to build an effective innovation ecosystem that will capitalize on the advanced technologies to create new products and to diffuse the technologies in the economy. Now, history has shown that remarkable progress has been made in the past by taking and implementing the necessary decisions towards the completion and reinforcement of the Union, often under the pressure of extraordinary circumstances, under the pressures of serious threats to the prosperity, stability, and viability of the Union. Impending crises help to focus minds and catalyze the adoption of the appropriate reforms and the implementation of common policies. So I conclude with a cautiously optimistic note. We can reasonably expect that despite the many challenges being faced, the right decisions will be taken to overcome the political difficulties, and progress will be made towards improving innovation and competitiveness and achieving higher, sustainable, and equitable economic growth. Why? Because the majority of European citizens understand the importance and the advantages of a stronger and more united Europe. Eventually, I believe the European project will be completed because most citizens and politicians will realize that there is no alternative viable option. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Papademos. After your penetrating analysis and some guidance for policy action, I don't know if I am more optimistic now or not. Anyway, I hope that these are the results of a dismal science and that politicians will be quite successful to build up a much broader and more prosperous prospect for our world. And talking about moving from European Union to the world as a whole, then we are very, very lucky to have with us Jeffrey Sachs, a Columbia University professor, to talk us on sustainability in the Anthropocene. Well, we know who is Professor Jeffrey Sachs. If I were to mention all his positions, all his achievements as a an economics professor, but as a policy advisor as well. If I were to do that, it will take all the time of his speech. So I'll limit myself mentioning some very, very basic features of his career. Professor Sachs is a native of Detroit, Michigan, received his BA, MA, and PhD from Harvard University. Jeffrey Sachs serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he holds the rank of university professor, the university's highest academic rank. Prior to joining Columbia, Professor Sachs spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University. He was director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University from 2002 to 2016, and he's president of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, co-chair of the Council of Engineers for the Energy Transition, academician of the Pontifical Academy of Social Science at Vatican, commissioner of the UN Broadband Commission for Development, and SDG advocate for the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres from 2001 to 2018. He has authored numerous books. I'll mention only 3 best-selling books: The End of Poverty, 2005, Commonwealth Economics for a Crowded Planet, 2008, and The Price of Civilization, 2011. His most recent book is on ethics in action for sustainable development. Professor Sachs was twice named among Time magazine's 100 most influential world leaders, and he has received 45 honorary doctorates, and his most recent award in 2020 was the Tank Prize in Sustainable Development, and also he received the Legion of Honor by decree of the President of the Republic of France. Well, I should stop here and invite Professor Sachs to take the floor.
Thank you very much. How wonderful to be in this famed academy and in this wonderful hall. Thank you for the kind introduction, and especially, Christos, thank you for bringing us together, and especially bringing us together as a koinon, as a community. The importance of a global community of science and scholars is more important than ever. And so all of us as invited guests are extremely fortunate to be part of this initiative, and also under Plato's mantle, which is the right place. Of course, where we are, Athens gave birth to all modern science, knowledge, and ethics for the Western world, and for, in key ways, for all of the world. So it's really a special privilege to be here. I want to add one important concept for us with koinon, and that is koinon agaton, which is Aristotle's term for the common good. So if koinon is community, agaton is community for the good. And this is Aristotle's definition of the purpose of politics itself. Politics is not the game of power. It's not the game of who can rise to power, who can grab resources, who can fight wars. Politics, properly seen, is koinon agaton. It is the pursuit of the common good by the common will and by the authorities of the state, which are to reflect the common will. We're a long way from that politics. And my main point in these brief remarks is that that is the only politics that can possibly keep us alive in our world and that can deliver us the future that we want for our children and our grandchildren. There is no other politics, not the politics of Donald Trump, not the politics of the United States, not the politics of the European Union as it is now exercised. These will not even deliver us survival, much less the common good. You may have noticed that a week ago, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved forward the doomsday clock hand to 84 seconds to midnight. That's the metaphor of how close we are to self-annihilation on this planet. The main risk is nuclear war, which is in front of us every day when we have psychologically unstable leaders like Trump and others that have nuclear arsenals. And the two of the most psychologically unstable people in the entire world, Trump and Netanyahu, will be meeting in the White House shortly. This is a deadly combination. That 84 seconds to midnight also signifies the other global scale threats we face, including the threats of the Anthropocene, meaning a world economy and society that is so overbearing on the planet that the physical consequences of our global economy are devastating. But as I was walking here today, I was just reading the latest news that the US Environmental Protection Agency is on the verge of eliminating the last standard against climate change because it is on the verge of changing a ruling that dates back 20 years that says that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are gases of concern for the Environmental Protection Agency. This is a measure of the ruthlessness, brazenness, corruption, and ignorance of my country's government. This is not a small matter. This is the world that we're dealing with, and have no doubt about it, because you in Europe call the United States an ally. And one of my major themes is the United States is your biggest enemy, actually. Not Russia, not China, but the United States as it's currently constituted. I don't mean the people, obviously. I mean the government. And I want to explain that. So what is our koinon agaton? What is our common good? To my mind, the best definition of the common good is sustainable development. This is a concept that has been introduced 40 years ago by Dr. Gro Brundtland, one of the true statesmen of our time. And it has been refined and adopted by the United Nations repeatedly since then. And by the UN, I don't mean the bureaucracy, I mean the member states, including the adoption in 2015 of Sustainable Development Goals. I call this our common good at the global scale. Sustainable development means the simultaneous achievement of economic well-being, social justice, environmental sustainability, and peace. Those four pillars. And those four pillars are embodied in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And remember that Goal 16 is peace, and Goal 17 is global cooperation. And know that the United States has openly declared this year that the Sustainable Development Goals are contrary to America's interests. And it pulled out of UNESCO explicitly on the grounds that the Sustainable Development Goals were contrary to American policy. At least Biden, who was a miserable president, had the decency to shut up about them. He didn't mention them for 4 years. But Trump is in open warfare against the Sustainable Development concept and the Sustainable Development Goals. These Sustainable Development Goals have public goods implications at all scales. At the local scale, Athens has to organize its affairs to ensure access to public services, to be a green economy, to be a healthful place. That's local challenges. Greece has to organize its affairs so that national policies are in line with the decarbonized energy system, with protecting this most miraculously beautiful part of the world and this fragile ecosystem of the Aegean. Regionally, sustainable development requires cooperation of neighbors. This is the most fundamental point of all of economics and sustainable development. Get along with your neighbor. You cannot achieve peace and well-being and decency if you are not engaged with your neighbor. The idea that Europe can prosper while Russia's on the other side is just one of these great myths. You prosper by being in a neighborhood of peace and cooperation. The Mediterranean needs a green energy system. Europe needs an interconnected grid. Not only can Europe not have an innovation system right now, it can't even put its grid together. So when Europe adopts a Green Deal, it then assigns it to 27 separate sovereign countries rather than a European-wide strategy, which is something mind-boggling to me. How can you achieve a European-wide objective if there is no European-wide planning and investment? And the answer is you can't. And the Koinon agaton is global scale, because we can't meet any of our planetary boundaries by local or national or regional actions alone. We need a global commitment. The fact that the United States has absented itself from the Paris Agreement and now is pulling out of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and never ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity and never ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas should tell you something. And instead of all of the fawning from Europe about how wonderful the United States is and how valuable it is as an ally, somebody should say something, that this is reprehensible, because we have global goals. The United States doesn't own the oceans, it doesn't own the climate, it doesn't own the atmosphere, so it has to behave for the Koinon agaton. But it doesn't even understand that concept. So if we're going to achieve sustainable development, we need cooperation and public action at all scales, from the local to the global. And there's a helpful concept which the European Union has adopted called subsidiarity, which says, of course, assign to the most local level the level of governance that can address that particular public good. So don't assign to the UN keeping the potholes filled in Athens. That belongs to the city of Athens. But don't assign to the city of Athens the challenge of climate safety. That belongs to the global level. And so we set the level of governance, the pursuit of the Koinon agaton, to the right level of governance. Well, we're not achieving sustainable development, not even close, and it's getting worse. And I think there are three conceptual frameworks that I want to contrast, because one of them can deliver the common good and the other two will deliver disaster. So the first concept is the world is anarchic. Each country is on its own. We're in a war of all against all. That is the American view. That was the British view. That was the view expounded back in 1640 by Thomas Hobbes, who said that in a state of nature, life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And Hobbes said, at a national level, you can put a Leviathan to keep order. But at the global level, it's just anarchy. So don't expect at the global level anything other than solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short existence. Expect conflict. And that's what we call realism in international relations. That's what's called realism. That we have an anarchic environment and that we're bound for conflict. Strike first if you have to. If there's going to be peace, the only way is peace through strength. What an absurd idea, by the way. What about peace through friendship, peace through negotiation, peace through demilitarization, peace through arms control? There are 1,000 ways for peace other than peace through strength. Peace through strength is almost a guarantee to war, because your strength is viewed as a threat to the other side, what's called the security dilemma. So the idea that peace through strength brings peace is a very convenient motto for the military-industrial complex, but is analytically a falsity. There is no peace through strength. There is only tension through strength. There is only escalation and arms races until the bloody moment happens. That is the American idea I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not here as a political activist, but just to warn you. Partly the reason Europe doesn't know it is it's filled with its own imperial history. So there's a grudging respect for that power, or a belief that that's the only way. Definitely, Britain will never be your savior. This is their mentality. They gave it to the Americans, and it continues to this day. But it doesn't work. The American government is run by its security state. It has no interest in Europe's well-being. And in fact, I will come back in a moment to Lucas's wonderful address, but if you have one real need in Europe, it is to have an industrial policy that protects you from the United States. That's how Airbus came, not because of markets and not because of the US, but because Europe got together to make an industrial policy. That's your only way forward in this world. The US will buy up any advanced technological company in Europe right now. You'll never have it unless you make your own champions. So there's a second idea that's even worse than the Hobbesian idea. And the second idea is a crude Darwinian idea, that there's just not enough to go around. And this is implicitly believed by a lot of people. And it was rather explicitly believed by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. There's just not enough living room to go around. The world's crowded. So we're naturally in a fight. It's not just the insecurity of anarchy, it's what Darwin rightly identified as a law of nature, or a principle of nature, which is that for most species, but not human beings, there is not enough for all the organisms born, so there is inevitably a struggle for survival, and therefore a selection of the fittest in that ecological niche. And that's the process of evolution by natural selection. And as you know, that was adopted by Spencer, by the German evolutionary biologists in the late 19th century, and by the social Darwinists across the world, and then by the Nazis, that we're in an inevitable struggle. Nation against nation, race against race, region against region, because there's not enough living room for the world. There's a very well-meaning idea that's similar today called degrowth. There's just not enough to go around. So the rich should hold back to make room for the poor. Well, that's a morally justifiable idea, but it's also wrong. The idea that there is a struggle for survival on the planet is wrong. The idea that the way that we are going to meet the planetary boundaries is by some kind of Malthusian crushing of living standards as we crash against the carrying capacity of Earth is not correct if we think. We're not running out of resources, we're misusing resources. That's a completely different point. We are not running out of energy. We have in incoming insolation every day, every moment, 5,000 to 10,000 times the energy we need on this planet. It's a matter of harvesting it. It's a matter of using solar power or other renewable energy, which is mostly solar power one way or another. Wind and solar has been shown in hundreds of studies to have enough capacity to provide 80% or more of the world's primary energy needs. And there are no other physical limits right now. We're not at the thermodynamic limits. The loose analogy that you can't have exponential growth on a finite planet of Kenneth Boulding and others, again, well-meaning, but not correct exactly, because we're not at thermodynamic limits, we're not at efficiency limits, we're not at resource limits. We're at Koinon agaton limits. We're at ethical limits. When you have a US government that says we don't care about the climate, that's a limit of intelligence, of honesty, of decency. But that's not a thermodynamic limit. So we don't lack solutions for combining economic well-being, social justice, environmental sustainability, and peace. We haven't run out of money for that. Peace is not only free, it would give us a peace dividend of perhaps 10% of world output, according to good studies. Social justice means that we share with people who don't have. An observation Jesus made in Matthew 25, which remains as true today. We can feed the least among us without breaking a sweat. And the idea that there is a crushing collision between nature and the economy is just not right. Yes, we are overshooting with the technologies that we're using. It turned out by sheer bad accident that carbon dioxide has quantum mechanical effects, that it absorbs infrared radiation. That turned out to be bad luck. That was discovered in the 1880s. But the problem with ethics is that since the 1880s, we haven't addressed that seriously. And even today, with all that we know, the US is about to try to expunge the science by decree, by the most unstable, ignorant, psychologically imbalanced leader that we have ever had. So there's a third view of global politics, and that's the view of Plato and Aristotle, which is what brings us here. Aristotle didn't call for the Koinon agaton because he was naive or idealistic, but because the fundamental idea of this place, this academy, of the original academy and of the original Lyceum, is that at least we can think as human beings. We have rationality. And Plato and Aristotle were very good observers. And they understood that human nature is divided. They talked about the divided soul, or the divided psyche or anima, between, as Aristotle put it, a vegetative or reproductive part, an instinctive or animal part, responding to stimuli, cause and effect, instincts, and a human part, reason. And their idea, 2,350 years ago, was that we can cultivate reason to find solutions. They were not naive. They struggled with this because they knew that humans are divided and that we can fall into our temptations and our instincts and our hatreds, or we can rise above them and seek solutions through practical wisdom, phronesis, and that we have that potential. And the entire idea of Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics and in the Politics is that there is a duality, that individual virtues of practical wisdom, of rationality, of temperance, of enough bravery to seek the truth, of a sense of justice, can translate into politics, because a virtuous citizenry can produce virtuous leaders. And virtuous leaders and a virtuous state can foster a virtuous citizenry. There is a tough problem, you'll notice. All of the possibilities of vicious as well as virtuous circles, where the lack of virtue of a leader instills the worst behaviors of the citizens, which in turn bring to power the trumps of this world, and the trumps of this world then bring out the worst in the citizens. Or the virtuous circle, that a wise and noble leader, we've had 2 or 3 such presidents in our 47 list. They're mostly mediocrities or jerks, but a few of them have been okay. Our greatest was Franklin Roosevelt, and he had the idea that there could be a united nations of the world. What a wonderful idea. and he really believed in it. And he believed in cooperation. And he even believed, and he was right, he was clever enough to cooperate with Uncle Joe Stalin, because his idea was that all nations need to cooperate, and that you are realistic, but you cooperate, because that's the way for survival on the planet. So that's the third view. That's the view of virtue ethics. That's the view of Plato and Aristotle. It's not an easy idea, I admit. It's a lot easier to believe in the Hobbesian idea, that it's just war of all against all, that man is a wolf to man, that there is no way out of the greed and the power lust, and that conflict is therefore inevitable. But in a nuclear age, we can be guaranteed that's the end. We don't know exactly when, but it will happen, because in a Hobbesian world, wars will come. And when the next war comes, the big one, somebody will fire a nuclear shot. And then if you've read Annie Jacobson's recent book, you'll understand that someone else will fire one, and then 10, and then 100 on the other side, and then thousands on all sides, and that's the end. And that's how close we are, because we're not thinking, because we don't understand virtue and ethics, and that it's a struggle, but that it's achievable, and that in our time, it is more important than ever. So what to do? First, we need global ethics. I hope in the next meeting here we have more people from China, from Russia, from Africa, although of course we have African representatives. And forgive me, I'm not meaning to be, I'm an invitee, so I don't mean to be in any way rude, but we need cooperation globally. And especially for us, most of us are scholars. There are no national barriers. We inherently speak a global language. And we need to. And we shouldn't close doors to anybody. And the European Union should stop putting sanctions on people who are trying to tell the truth, and stop trying to break relations with Russian scholars, for example, and Russian institutions. This is shameful, but more than shameful, it's completely self-destructive. Europe cannot thrive without a healthy relationship with Russia. And ladies and gentlemen, you should really understand, I know it sounds strange, the United States for 30 years was out to break any strong relation between Europe and Russia. Out to break it. Absolutely, from Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, the idea that Germany and Russia would get together was viewed as a terrifying idea by the American security state. That would be a threat to American hegemony, another good Greek word. So there was no will for the natural evolution. I happen to know it because I was an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev and to Boris Yeltsin. They wanted peace. The United States didn't want peace. The United States wanted dominance. That's a very different idea. Europe shamefully went along with it. And I say shamefully because Helmut Kohl on February 10th, 1990, said to Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward. He said it. His foreign minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, said it. US Secretary of State James Baker III said it. It was all a lie. But what the Soviet Union wanted was peace. What Boris Yeltsin wanted was peace. And you'd be surprised to know that what Vladimir Putin wanted when he came to office and he came and spoke in the European Parliament and in the Bundestag, he wanted peace too. You wouldn't know it from the relentless propaganda in Europe and the United States of the deep state, but that's the truth. So if Europe is going to prosper, it should make peace with Russia, it should make peace with China, it should have open trade and good relations, it should not be importing liquefied natural gas from the United States at 6 times what was coming out of the pipeline from Nord Stream. Europe should not have committed economic suicide, and people should know the basic truth of that. The second thing that we need is effective governance. And effective governance is a combination of what Aristotle called episteme and techne, scientific knowledge and technical knowledge. By the way, as you know, Plato and Aristotle were not the greatest fans of democracy. I think they could live with it in certain forms, but what they wanted was governance of decency and governance of competence. And so there's a technical and scientific element of that. Obviously, in the United States, we have no science right now at the top, the opposite. We don't have one PhD in the US cabinet, by the way, of 35 cabinet members, not one. One person has a master's degree in a technical subject. That's it. The rest are grifters, by the way. They're corrupt cheats, almost all of them. Some are just incompetent, but most of them are grifters. They don't want technical people around. They don't want one of you raising a hand in the cabinet meeting saying, Mr. President, actually climate change is not a hoax. Let me explain the atmospheric physics, if I might, Mr. President. They don't want that. And they don't have that. So governments need technical capacity. By the way, when I counted, the Chinese government, I think, if I counted correctly, has 11 technical PhDs. The Chinese cabinet, the Politburo, an equal number. That's a government of engineers primarily. So we need technical knowledge, we need planning. Where is Europe's planning? There isn't planning. There are goals. Goals are not plans. Goals are objectives. Goals are not plans. I love the European Green Deal, but when I asked where the plan was, they laughed at me. Mr. Sachs, what are you talking about, plan? We're in Europe. Don't look for a plan. And indeed, there is no plan. And there needs to be industrial policy, because the essence of industrial policy is that in any of the challenges that are faced, whether it's AI, or whether it's green energy, or whether it's the conversion to electric vehicles, or whether it's resilience to climate change, these are both public and private activities. Some are appropriately led by the private sector. Most require public investment and regulation. So there has to be industrial policy. That's not a highfalutin idea, that's a basic idea. But it's denied rhetorically. The United States is filled with industrial policy, mainly from the Pentagon and the security state. Where do you think Silicon Valley came from? Do you think it came from the garage and the private initiatives? Or do you think it came from the CIA and the space missions? If you think it came from the garage, let's talk about it. Because you have a misunderstanding. So Europe needs an industrial policy urgently to stop every one of its top enterprises being grabbed by the United States and sucked off and blocked off. And Europe produces the best microchips, the only microchip printer in the world, ASML. Who controls it, the United States or Europe? Of course, it's the United States that controls it. That's absurd, ladies and gentlemen. Completely absurd. And if you would trust me on one thing, Russia's not invading you. Then you could think clearly about all the rest. You do not need the United States for your protection right now. You need a phone call to Moscow to sit down to discuss, to end the NATO enlargement. And then you could think clearly about your own future, which is 450 million people. It could be 550 million people, much larger than the United States. So that leads me just to the third concluding what to do, and that is the point about ethics, about Koinon agaton. First, we need to get our basic idea right. What are we after? It is not true that the United States has run ahead of Europe in well-being. The opposite. The quality of life in the United States is collapsing. The GDP might say something different, but look at measures of well-being. The US and Europe were at the same life expectancy 40 years ago. Europe is 4 to 6 years longer life expectancy than the United States today. That's the quality of life. Look at life satisfaction. Europe tops the entire list. The United States keeps sinking farther and farther. Look at my neighborhood on the Upper West Side, a shooting on one corner, a knifing on the other corner in recent months. Garbage that doesn't get collected. That's quality of life? No. That's a society that puts soldiers on the streets, that are killing people in cold blood, and where we have a demented leader. I don't know, the other one was demented, literally. This one is just psychologically completely unstable. So first, we need the concept of eudaimonia, the concept of well-being, because you can't choose the Koinon agaton without knowing what you're aiming for. If you're aiming for GDP per capita, you're aiming at the wrong thing. Yes, aim for technological advance, but that's quite different. That is just industrial policy that's needed, and keeping the US hands off of your early stage cutting edge companies. Then you'll have a flourishing tech sector. But the United States is the enemy of that. They do not want you to have it. And you want to know another secret? If you really want to have it, partner with China. They're really good. They're really good. They're doing all sorts of innovation. We go every 3 or 4 months. The advances are breathtaking. And you know what? They're for green technologies, not what the United States is doing, which is abandoning the green technologies. Of course, we're all going to have to think about AI because it's going to change jobs, it's going to change the income distribution, it's going to require fundamental transformations. But who can use that the best in the world? It is regions with a social democratic ethos. That means Europe. Europe is very well poised to use artificial intelligence well because you've already socialized healthcare, socialized education. These are good things, not bad things. It means that society can act for the common good. So don't lose the basics. Europe has the highest quality of life in the world by objective standards. That should be your starting point. to understand that. You've created something quite wonderful here. The main reason is that Europe abandoned its imperial destiny after World War II. Enough was enough. And Europe looked inward and built a wonderful society based on social democratic ethos. I'm not talking about capital S, capital D parties. I'm talking about the ethos that everybody is part of the society. That's what puts Europe ahead. Don't let the Hobbesian vision of war of all against all, or the Malthusian vision of the struggle for survival mislead us. If we're guided by ethics, by the ethics that were invented right here where we are today, we can find a way forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Professor Sachs. Well, you exceeded the time I planned initially to give it to you, but, you know, I didn't dare to interrupt you because your speech was music to my ears, but not only to my ears, to the ears of the audience, I guess. Thank you very, very much for your speech and reminding us that the classics could play, even today, could play a role in our life. Thank you very, very much. Now, we are under time pressure, as you understand. So, I'll give the floor now to a non-economist, but very, very well-known political analyst, professor of international relations. And since we need more cooperation, as Professor Sachs said, I'll ask Mr. Syrigos to take the floor. He's well known to us, a very, very, you know, good political scientist, specialist in international affairs, and he enriches our daily lives with his interventions and explaining to us what really happens in our neighborhood. Professor Syrigos, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to speak to the inaugural Symposium of the International Community, Koinon of Academies. And I would like to thank especially Professor Zerefos for taking the initiative to make real this old vision of the International Community of Academies. I have the honor to participate here as a member of the academic board of Krispis and Samara International Legal Studies Foundation, which is a sponsor of the symposium and has recently been awarded by the Academy of Athens. Ladies and gentlemen, according to Greek mythology, Argo was the first ship to enter the Black Sea. Jason and the other mythical heroes who sailed aboard here, the Argonauts, were in search of the legendary Golden Fleece, believed to be located in Kolchis. Kolchis was a city at the far eastern edge of the Black Sea. At that time, access to the Black Sea through the Bosphorus was blocked by the Symplegades, two massive rocks that constantly crashed into one another, destroying any vessel that attempted to pass. The Argonauts rowed with all their strength, and their ship became the first to sail safely between the two rocks, which thereafter remained fixed. From that moment on, and for nearly 3 millennia, the shortest and most direct routes for transporting goods from the Black Sea to the wider world has been through the Straits of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. In July 2020, this reality changed decisively. The first rail freight transport from Alexandroupolis in northern Aegean to Constanța in Romania was completed. The inaugural journey lasted 55 hours. Since then, approximately 80 rail transports have been carried out, with average transit time ranging between 43 to 45 hours. Under ideal conditions, a vessel requires roughly 2 days to complete the same journey via the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. In practice, however, frequently ships face long queues and delays while waiting to transit the Bosphorus. And we have to take into consideration that adverse weather conditions, particularly strong winds in open seas, often cause additional delays. The situation has become even more complex since 2022. The war between Russia and Ukraine has led to a sharp and sustained increase in insurance costs for vessels operating to the Black Sea. According to market sources, insurers now charge premiums of 1% of a ship's value for access to ports in the region. As a result, under ideal circumstances for ships, rail transport is now marginally faster than maritime transport. The transit times achieved via Alexandroupolis to Constanța are particularly noteworthy given the current limitations of the regional rail infrastructure. Railway networks, both in Bulgaria and Romania, are primarily oriented west to east rather than north to south. That means they connect the sea, the Black Sea, with the capitals, Constanța to Bucharest and Varna to Sofia. This means that at present there is no fully operational continuous rail corridor between Alexandroupolis with Constanța via Bulgaria. The route exists only as separate national segments, and no international passenger services operate along it. Within this broader context, a strategic vision emerges: the creation of a rail corridor linking the Greek port of Alexandroupolis with the Ukrainian port of Odessa via Constanța in Romania and Varna or potentially Burgas in Bulgaria. Let us name provisionally this train corridor Rail EUXINA. The importance of Rail EUXINA is difficult to underestimate. Ukraine is among the world's most significant suppliers of grain, particularly to North Africa and the Middle East, and global markets. And prior to Russian invasion, Ukraine had 10 commercial ports in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. These handled approximately 90% of the country's foreign trade. Today, only 3 ports remain under Ukrainian control, all located in the greater Odessa area. Constanța is the largest port and the busiest port in the Western Balkans and the Black Sea, and it has very deep water terminals and modern facilities which allow it to accommodate large vessels efficiently, making it a cornerstone of regional supply chains. Varna is Bulgaria's largest and most strategically significant port on the Black Sea. It serves as a gateway to both domestic and regional trade in the Balkans. Last but not least, the structural conditions for the development of Alexandroupolis are close to optimal. Extensive works have rendered the port both spacious and secure. In December 2022, the port of Alexandroupolis was reintegrated into the Trans-European Transport Network, paving the way for further infrastructure upgrades. The port's land zone is approximately 1,100 hectares. By comparison, the port of Thessaloniki occupies 1,500 hectares. Alexandroupolis is already a key energy hub. A natural gas pipeline connecting Greece and Bulgaria terminates in the city, and since 2025, a permanent floating storage and regasification unit, the so-called FSRU, has been in operation. The regasified LNG supplies Bulgaria and Romania, and with onward connections branching westwards towards Hungary and Slovakia, and eastwards towards Moldova and Ukraine, aims to provide gas to these countries as well. In order to understand better this vision, we have to keep in mind the distances between key regional cities in the area. The port of Alexandroupolis lies 220 kilometers from Burgas, 300 kilometers from Varna, 450 kilometers from Constanza, and less than 800 kilometers from Odessa. These distances illustrate the efficiency of a dedicated rail corridor. Under optimal conditions, a shipment could travel from Odessa to Alexandroupolis in less than 10 hours. Should the ports of Odessa region be effectively connected by modern rail to Constanza in Romania, Varna in Bulgaria, and Alexandroupolis in Greece, rail EUXINA would emerge as the principal transport axis for trade among the Western Black Sea countries, Bulgaria, Romania, and Ukraine. It will mean, rail EUXINA will mean the following. First of all, avoidance of choke points, completely bypasses Bosphorus and Dardanelles, which are the world's most congested straits. Predictability and resilience. Rail schedules are more reliable than sea transit through the straits, where delays can last for days. Geopolitical flexibility. It reduces vulnerability on ship passing through areas which could be military targets. It has to be reminded that since November 2025, several vessels trading to countries in the Black Sea have been hit in a series of drone strikes. Thus, rail EUXINA is very attractive for European Union and NATO logistics, as well as military mobility. It also means, from the environmental point of view, it means lower emissions, because electrified rail, once completed, is significantly cleaner than shipping with waiting times at anchor. And finally, it means European Union strategic autonomy, because it strengthens Europe's independent transport and supply networks. In other words, rail EUXINA is not a replacement to the Straits of Bosphorus and Dardanelles. It is a strategic alternative. Realizing the vision of rail EUXINA requires a coordinated series of infrastructure upgrades. A continuous rail must link Constanza in Romania with Odessa in Ukraine. The problem here are the different track gauges between the two countries. Ukraine uses the Soviet 1,520 millimeters gauge, while Romania, Bulgaria, and Greece use the standard 1,435 millimeters standard gauge for European countries. Freight will therefore require either transshipment or bogie changes at borders. A similar solution is needed between Constanza and Alexandroupolis, Greece. Historically, connecting Odessa to the Aegean via Romania and Bulgaria was not a European priority. Back in the 1990s, we had the so-called Axis 9 of the European Union, which aimed to link Alexandroupolis with Helsinki, not Ukraine. And this was later overlooked. Nevertheless, Russia's invasion and the European Union's commitment to closer integration with Ukraine have reshaped priorities. Today, the focus is on grain exports, and tomorrow on reconstruction materials for Ukraine. Alexandroupolis must also be upgraded into a modern cargo hub, akin to a small Piraeus, I can say, with cranes for rapid ship handling, extensive storage facilities, and a rail terminal integrated with the airport, unique in the region. Funding has to come primarily from the European Union, following the precedent of Rail Baltica. Rail Baltica is a high-speed electrified rail corridor, connecting the Baltic states to Central Europe. It starts from Poland and it goes up to Helsinki. Its total cost is 6 billion euros, and 85% is financed by the European Union under the Connecting Europe facility, highlighting the strategic importance of trans-European corridors. Once completed, Rail EUXINA will provide a fast, reliable, and secure overland link from the Western Black Sea to Europe, reduce dependence on congested maritime routes, enhance logistic efficiency, and support regional economic growth and European strategic autonomy. 3 seas to the east. These were the words of Centaur Chiron when asked by Jason how he will reach the Golden Fleece. 3 seas to the east, Centaur Chiron said to Jason. This was the journey that the Argonauts had to undertake in order to reach the mythical land of Colchis, the home of Golden Fleece, somewhere in modern-day Ukraine. Today, that ancient voyage inspires a modern vision. If we move swiftly and strategically, the 3 seas to the east can be reduced to a seamless land corridor. The journey to the Black Sea, linking the Western Black Sea ports with Europe and the wider world, can become entirely overland, fast, secure, and independent of maritime choke points. In other words, what was once a perilous multi-sea expedition can now be transformed into a single, efficient, and resilient rail connection, Rail EUXINA. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Syrigos, for giving us a very, very comprehensive idea of new ways of cooperation, regional cooperation in a critical area in our region. Now, I am, of course, under huge time pressure, and it falls also on your shoulders, dear Phoebe. Well, Phoebe Kondouri is very well known, renowned for pioneering human-centric interdisciplinary mathematical systems that enable the sustainable interaction between nature, society, and the economy. She has held academic positions at the University of Cambridge, UCLA, LSE, University of Reading, and the Technical University of Denmark. She's currently professor at the School of Economics at the Athens University of Economics and Business, visiting professor at the Department of Earth Sciences, University of Cambridge, and she has published a lot, about 20 books, if I remember well, and numerous articles in high-level professional journals. In order to make my introduction very, very short, I'll ask you to take the floor, and please try in 15 minutes to 20 maximum.
So can I have my slides on, please? President of the Academy of Athens, General Secretary of the Koinon of Academies, I'm deeply honored to be invited to speak in this launch event of almost 40 academies around the world coming back geographically, but also with respect to the continuation of values, wisdom, and virtue that the Plato's Academy transposes to the Academy of Athens. I'm particularly thankful to Professor Zerefors for bringing this very important initiative to our country. So I will try to very quickly give you the framework in which we try to achieve sustainable development. I'm one of these interdisciplinary economists that work between the different systems, the natural system, the infrastructural system, the economic system, and the social system in order to identify transformation pathways towards achieving sustainability. When I started my career 30 years ago, investing in the interdisciplinary space was considered wrong, at least for an economist. Nowadays, there is a structural shift, and we are close to understanding how important interdisciplinarity is and how much economics is needed in that space. So we often talk about the almost permanent multi-crisis that we are facing. We have the environmental crisis, climate change, biodiversity collapse, increased pollution, and on top of this, the economic crisis, low growth rates, 1/3 of the countries at the brink of default, and the difficulty in integrating the huge pace of technological advancements in the productivity. That's a major issue in the economics, in economic growth and in built-in economic competitiveness, and it has been touched upon. And third, the social crisis, the increasing inequality between the global north and the global south, but also increasing inequalities within countries between geographical areas and income groups. On top, geopolitical pressures and crises, and a collapsing multilateral system. As Professor Jeff Sachs said, in 2015, we have launched and not siloed framework that we agreed, and we as the nations of the world agreed to work together in an interdisciplinary, holistic, integrated system in order to support our development, in order to support the welfare of nations. And these are the 17 SDGs, 4 about planetary boundaries, as have been made famously known by the lead of Rick Institute. 8 goals about society, and another 4 about the economy. 16 goals that integrate the natural system, the social system, and the economic system, and a last goal for the collaboration, cooperation for achieving these goals. So we have already agreed this. 17 goals, 169 targets, and this is a way away from the multi-crisis. Why? Because it is in the silos of our political issues, in the silos of our science issues, in the silos of our social and national issues, that we fail to see the synergies that are there and will allow us to go towards sustainable development. So we need to break silos. And what I am working on with a big team of researchers is building systems transformation that are science-based, and it's a crucial time for science in order to hedge against misinformation and disinformation, that are stakeholder co-design, because unless you make everybody shareholder of the transformation, nothing will ever be implemented, and a blended finance supported. Most money in the world are not in public hands. They are in private hands. So we need to attract private money, private capital, in order to finance the chain. So the real constraint here, it's not money, is translation. Translating public goals into investable projects, long-term needs into fund-compatible assets, and risks that exist into risks that is priced and allocated. The SDGs are a brilliant, comprehensive, integrated, holistic framework for transformation towards sustainable development. As a humanity, we have the data, the science, the technology, even the financial resources in public and private sector in order to implement it. Yet implementation is around approximately 20% globally. Why? Well, for me, the key challenge is that while the SDGs provide direction, there is no robust structure explicitly tasked with driving their implementation. So what I am doing in my team, in my collaboration with the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network that Professor Sachs is leading, and in my work as the chief scientist for the UN Global Sustainable Development Report, what I'm building is what I think we need. And what we need is an operational global commons, an operational global Koinon, capable of aligning global efforts, creating accountability, and ensuring effective coordination. And at the end of the day, deliver results on the ground. And this is what I will show you. I will sketch the approach for creating these global commons. And as I said before, okay, let me try something else. Yeah, as I said before, I've been given the honor to lead the Global Sustainable Development Report of 2027. This is a report that happens every 4 years. This will be the last report before 2030, the deadline for achieving the SDGs, and it will be instrumental, not just an assessment of assessments, which is the mandate of this report, but it will be instrumental for defining the future of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. So in this report, we are presenting evidence-based policy guidance for integrated action that creates accountability and accelerates progress. 3 steps. This is our approach. The first is continuous measurement, monitoring, and assessment with regards to where we are today as a country, as a region of the world, as a global community, with regards to achieving each and every goal, each and every one of the 169 targets. And I will show you that we have created an elaborate framework of matrices that allows us a very good idea of where we are. The second step is to develop pathways for achieving the SDGs and national commitments per country and between countries, and doing that using system science and stakeholder co-design. And the third step is to identify financing means for the transition policies and the investment portfolios. So in effect, you are building a digital twin of each and every country that can be integrated between countries in regions so that they can be implemented and succeed sustainable development. With regards to measurement, we have, as I said, extensive network. The Sustainable Development Solutions Network has put together a framework of metrics that allows measuring the performance against the SDGs for the globe, for regions of the world, for national and subnational editions. My team has also transposed these SDGs into private goals, private company goals, stock markets, so that you can really infiltrate into the microeconomy the transition. And once you have the knowledge of where you are, what you need is your policy framework, where you are going, so the translation of SDGs into policy frameworks, which we've done in Europe, but they exist for almost every region of the world. So you have a policy framework with laws and regulations that identify where you want to go if you are going to meet the SDGs. And in the second step, you are actually building the pathways. So you bring together all the needed data for your interdisciplinary systems, the natural data, data that has to do with natural sciences, geospatial data, Internet of Things data, socioeconomic data, real-time data. We build the data infrastructure where this data will be made available, completely open access to each and everybody who is interested to use. And then you start feeding your models with the data in order to produce the pathways. The first elements are the planetary boundaries, like Rick Institute is leading, translating and downscaling those planetary boundaries into country scale so that you can integrate with your country development plans. Then, using a beyond GDP economic model, which means that you are taking into account not just produced capital, but also natural capital and human capital, all forms of capitals, and integrating all externalities, all the goods and services that are not monetized by the private markets. And then you integrate, once you see where you are, given the first calibration of the general equilibrium model of the current situation, you then integrate energy modeling that will showcase how you are going to achieve net zero, meaning what should be the changes in technology and data sources and green corridors in order to achieve climate neutrality in Europe and beyond. The transport model, the water model, the land use model, the marine use model, or softly integrated and then again recalibrated. But all of them optimized, softly integrated, and then again recalibrated in the beyond GDP general equilibrium model in order to identify the effects on economic sectors, the effects on trade, and identify also the cost of needed transformations. So you know, you start the conversation about how you finance it. So my current ERC project puts together the natural models, the infrastructural models, the economic and the social models in order at the end of the day to have the ability to continuously measure and monitor and assess, to identify policies and governance transformation, to identify technology transformations and capacity building investments, and finally, identify fiscal and financial pathways. Each and every step, from data gathering to running each and every model, to integrating the models, to deriving the technological pathways, the financial pathways, the capacity building pathways, the social pathways, we consult with the stakeholders. At the moment, we have done the model for Europe, the Balkans, UK, almost completed the whole of Asia, and we are leading our efforts together with 2-3 other research centers across the world that can define these pathways. All of the information, the models, the solutions are available, open access, the data are available, open access, and they provide the detail and guidance that is needed in order to be able to truly provide guidelines to governments that can be relevant, because what you tell the finance minister is consistent with what you tell the Minister of Agriculture, what you tell the Minister of Energy, what you tell the Minister of Transport, and so on. So it is in the synergies and trade-offs of these sectoral models And in the integration between the systems, the natural, the infrastructural, the economic and social systems, that the solutions are lying. And this is how implementation can be accelerated. This is how transparency can be actually made available. And this is how you can facilitate implementation, because you have the stakeholders engaged in a science-based transformation. They don't need to understand the models. They just need to understand and work with you in co-designing what needs to be done in order to achieve the implementation of the solution pathways. And at the end of the day, and I'm closing with this because I think it's important, when all the data, when all the science, when all the financial articulation of the implementation of the pathways is open access and transparent, then implementation is much easier, especially if it's co-facilitated with capacity building. But also, it is much easier to identify free riders, to identify manipulation, misinformation, disinformation. So science has a very crucial role to play. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Koundouris, for a comprehensive but a passionate presentation of the ways we can achieve the sustainable goals. Well, dear friends, I would like to apologize for not exercising my power to impose discipline on our speakers. But it was so interesting, the speeches were very, very interesting, so I thought that it's better to deviate from the rules, because small deviation may enhance our eudaimonia, our welfare. And I think by doing that, our welfare was improved a bit. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.